September 6, 1976. Hakodate Airport, northern Japan. At 1:11 p.m. local time, a Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat drops out of the sky with 30 seconds of fuel remaining. The pilot violates Japanese airspace. Ignoring radio calls, air traffic controllers freeze. The interceptor's engines flame out. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko glides a 20-ton missile onto a civilian runway at 200 miles per hour. He opens the canopy, climbs down, walks toward the terminal with his hands raised. The aircraft he just abandoned was the most feared machine in the Cold War sky. Within hours, CIA Director George H.W. Bush will call this moment an intelligence bonanza. Within 60 days, American engineers will tear this jet apart, bolt by bolt. And what they'll find will change everything the Pentagon believed about Soviet air power. The MiG-25 wasn't the superweapon the West thought it was. It was something far more complicated. Officially, the MiG-25 Foxbat was a technological marvel. Soviet propaganda called it invincible. American intelligence estimated it could outrun anything in the sky. NATO pilots were told to avoid engagement at all costs. The United States spent $6 billion designing the F-15 Eagle specifically to counter this threat. Quietly, the evidence told a different story. The jet Belenko delivered to Japan used vacuum tubes instead of transistors. Its airframe was built from heavy welded steel, not advanced titanium alloys. The engines couldn't sustain high speed without melting. The fuel consumption was catastrophic, and the avionics were a decade behind Western standards. So, which version was true? Was the MiG-25 a wonder weapon or a paper tiger? Did the Soviets deceive the West on purpose, or did American intelligence simply get it wrong? And what does it say about Cold War strategy when both sides are operating on incomplete information? Those questions don't have simple answers. But the documents do exist. The engineering reports, the debriefing transcripts, the photographs of a disassembled Soviet interceptor spread across a hangar floor in Japan. This is the story of how one pilot's decision to defect exposed the gap between reputation and reality. My name is Dr. Rowan Halberg. I'm a military engineering historian. I spent almost 30 years analyzing classified aircraft programs. I've held documents that were supposed to stay buried. I've read after-action reports that contradicted official timelines. And I've interviewed pilots who knew the truth but couldn't speak it. This channel exists because those stories deserve to be told. Not the sanitized versions, not the propaganda, the actual record, the engineering failures, the political decisions, the human costs. Every aircraft has secrets. Some of those secrets expose incompetence, some expose deception, and some expose the gap between what we're told and what actually happened. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko was not supposed to exist in American history. He was a Soviet Air Defense Forces pilot stationed at Chuguyevka Air Base near Vladivostok, 29 years old, married, father to a young son. On paper, he had everything a Soviet officer could want: security, status, access to the USSR's most advanced interceptor. But Belenko had spent 3 years flying the MiG-25, and he knew something the rest of the world didn't. The jet was a fraud. Not a complete fraud. It could fly fast. It could climb high. But the performance numbers the Soviets published, the capabilities NATO feared, they were exaggerations built on selective truths, and Belenko had documentation to prove it. Flight logs, maintenance records, engineering manuals. He'd been collecting evidence for months, hiding pages inside his flight suit, memorizing fuel burn rates and structural limits. He also had personal reasons to leave. His marriage was collapsing. His base commander was corrupt. The conditions at Chuguyevka were deplorable. Pilots were living in crumbling barracks with broken heating in a region where winter temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Food rations were inadequate, alcoholism was rampant, and the propaganda about Soviet superiority felt more suffocating every day. On September 6, 1976, Belenko made his choice. Here's what we're going to uncover. First, the defection itself. How Belenko executed a high-risk escape plan with no backup and no certainty of survival. Second, the disassembly. What American engineers found when they took the MiG-25 apart piece by piece. Third, the intelligence failure. Why the West got this aircraft so catastrophically wrong, and what that miscalculation cost. And finally, the aftermath. What happened to Belenko, what the Soviets did with the returned wreckage, and what this whole episode revealed about the psychology of Cold War competition. But before we get into the technical breakdown, we need to understand one thing. Belenko didn't just steal a jet. He stole the Soviet Union's reputation. And the CIA was about to find out that reputation was built on very shaky ground. The plan. Belenko's defection wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. He'd been planning for at least 6 months, maybe longer. The timeline in his 1980 autobiography, MiG Pilot, lays out the preparation. He studied flight routes. He memorized Japanese airspace boundaries. He learned enough English phrases to communicate with air traffic control. And he waited for the right mission profile. The opportunity came during a routine training sortie. September 6th was supposed to be a standard intercept drill over the Sea of Japan. Belenko's orders were to take off, patrol a designated zone, and return to base within 90 minutes standard procedure. Nothing suspicious. But Belenko had already decided this would be his last flight in Soviet airspace. The MiG-25's range was the critical variable. The interceptor carried approximately 14,000 kilograms of fuel. At cruising speed and altitude, that gave the aircraft roughly 2.5 hours of flight time. But the MiG-25 was not designed for efficiency. It was designed for high-altitude, high-speed intercepts against American bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Fuel burn at maximum performance was staggering. At Mach 2.8 and 70,000 feet, the engines consumed fuel at a rate that would drain the tanks in less than 30 minutes. Belenko knew the numbers. He'd flown enough sorties to understand the jet's limitations. His plan was to fly low and slow to conserve fuel, then make a dash across the Sea of Japan to Hakodate. The distance from Chuguyevka to Hakodate was roughly 400 kilometers. At subsonic speed, staying below radar coverage, he estimated he could reach Japanese airspace with maybe 10 minutes of fuel remaining. He was wrong. It was closer to 30 seconds. Here's the thing about fuel calculations. They're based on ideal conditions. No wind, no deviations, no emergencies. Real-world flying doesn't work that way. Belenko had to navigate by dead reckoning because he couldn't use radio beacons without alerting Soviet air defense. He had to stay low to avoid radar detection, which increased drag and fuel consumption, and he had to account for the possibility that Soviet fighters might scramble to intercept him. By the time he crossed into Japanese airspace, the fuel gauges were reading empty. The engines were running on vapor. Belenko had no idea if he'd even make it to an airport. His backup plan, if you can call it that, was to eject over land and hope Japanese authorities found him before Soviet agents did. But the engines held. Barely. He spotted Hakodate Airport through the haze, lowered his landing gear, dropped his speed, and put the MiG-25 down on a civilian runway with commercial airliners parked nearby. The The moment the wheels touched asphalt, both engines flamed out, 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Documented in the Japanese Defense Force report filed later that day. Belenko had made it, but he wasn't safe yet. The immediate response. The airport went into lockdown. Japanese authorities surrounded the aircraft. Belenko climbed out of the cockpit, hands raised, shouting in broken English that he was defecting and requesting asylum. Japanese police detained him. The aircraft was towed to a secure hangar, and the diplomatic nightmare began. The Soviet Union demanded immediate return of the pilot and the aircraft. They claimed Belenko had suffered a mental breakdown, that he'd lost his way during a training flight, that the defection was a misunderstanding. The Japanese government, under pressure from Moscow, initially considered complying. But the United States intervened. This is where George H.W. Bush enters the story. Bush was Director of Central Intelligence at the time. He understood what Belenko's defection represented. This wasn't just a propaganda win. This was an intelligence opportunity that might never come again. The CIA had spent years trying to get access to a MiG-25 satellite imagery, could only tell you so much. Radar tracks gave you performance data, but not design philosophy. What they needed was the actual machine. And now one had just landed in Japan with the pilot willing to talk. Bush personally flew to Japan to oversee the operation. The CIA negotiated with Japanese officials. They agreed to a deal. Belenko would receive asylum in the United States. The MiG-25 would be examined by American and Japanese engineers. And then, eventually, the aircraft would be returned to the Soviet Union. The Soviets agreed. They didn't have much choice. But they demanded the examination be limited. No invasive disassembly. No photography of classified components. The Japanese government agreed to those terms. The CIA ignored them completely. What followed was one of the most thorough technical intelligence operations of the Cold War. Over the next 67 days, American engineers took the MiG-25 apart. Down to the last rivet, they photographed everything, measured everything, tested everything, and what they found contradicted nearly every assumption Western intelligence had made about Soviet aviation technology. But before we get to those discoveries, we need to talk about what the West thought the MiG-25 was. Because the gap between perception and reality was enormous. And that gap had cost the United States billions of dollars. The paper tiger revealed. The first shock came within hours of the disassembly beginning. American engineers opened the avionics bay, expecting to find advanced Soviet electronics, miniaturized circuits, solid-state transistors, components comparable to American F-15 systems. Instead, they found vacuum tubes, hundreds of them, glowing glass tubes, the kind of technology the United States had phased out of military aircraft in the early 1960s. The MiG-25's radar system, fire control computer, and navigation instruments were all built on tube-based circuitry. The engineers couldn't believe it. One CIA technical analyst later described the moment as seeing a Formula One race car with a steam engine under the hood. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because vacuum tubes weren't necessarily a weakness, they were a choice. And understanding why the Soviets made that choice reveals something important about Cold War engineering philosophy. Vacuum tubes are heavy. They consume more power than transistors. They generate more heat. They're bulkier. All of that is true. But they also have advantages. Tubes are resistant to electromagnetic pulse effects. They can handle voltage spikes better than early transistors. They're easier to manufacture with low-precision tooling. And in a military context where reliability matters more than elegance, tubes had a proven track record. The Soviets weren't stupid. They had transistor technology, but they also had an industrial base that struggled with quality control. Tube production was mature, predictable, and for an interceptor designed to fly a handful of high-altitude sorties before being destroyed or grounded, tubes were good enough. The Americans didn't see it that way. To them, this was evidence of technological backwardness, proof that the MiG-25 was a generation behind Western fighters. The CIA report noted the tubes with a tone of dismissive surprise. But what they missed was the philosophical difference. The Soviets weren't trying to build the most advanced interceptor. They were trying to build the most effective one for their specific operational requirements. And that brings us to the airframe. The MiG-25 structure was built from welded steel, not titanium, not aluminum alloys, steel. Specifically, a type of nickel-steel alloy called VNS2. The fuselage, wings, and tail were all steel construction. Total airframe weight, approximately 20 tons empty. For comparison, the F-15 Eagle, which was designed to counter the MiG-25, weighed about 13 tons empty. Why steel? Again, this was a choice driven by Soviet industrial realities. Titanium was expensive, difficult to machine, prone to cracking under thermal stress. The USSR had limited titanium production capacity, and what they did produce went to submarines and strategic bombers. Steel was cheap, abundant, and for an aircraft designed to fly straight and fast at high altitude, steel was structurally sufficient. But there was a cost. That extra weight killed maneuverability. The MiG-25 couldn't dogfight. Its turn rate was abysmal. In a close-range engagement with a Western fighter like the F-4 Phantom or the F-15, the MiG-25 would lose every time. American test pilots who later flew the MiG-25 described it as flying a brick. The control responses were sluggish. The roll rate was slow. It was a pure interceptor designed to climb, fire missiles, and run. Nothing more. The Americans had assumed the MiG-25 could dogfight. They'd built the F-15 with that assumption in mind. Turned out they'd been preparing for a threat that didn't exist. Then there was the engine situation. The MiG-25 used two Tumansky R-15 B300 turbojet engines. Massive power plants capable of producing over 24,000 pounds of thrust each. On paper, that thrust could push the aircraft to Mach 3.2. In practice, it couldn't. The engines had a fatal flaw. At speeds above Mach 2.8, the turbine blades would overheat. The metallurgy couldn't handle sustained high-speed operation. Pilots were explicitly forbidden from exceeding Mach 2.8 for more than a few minutes. Push it harder, and the engines would suffer catastrophic damage. Belenko confirmed this in his debriefing. He'd never flown faster than Mach 2.83, and even that was during a test flight with ground controllers monitoring engine temperatures in real time. The fuel consumption was equally problematic. At maximum speed, the MiG-25 burned fuel at a rate of over 3 tons per minute. Total fuel capacity was 14 tons, do the math. At Mach 2.8, the aircraft had maybe 5 minutes of flight time before the tanks ran dry. That's not a combat-capable fighter. That's a very fast lawn dart. So why did Western intelligence think the MiG-25 could do more? Because the Soviets let them think it. Propaganda footage showed the aircraft climbing at impossible angles. Speed records were set under controlled conditions with stripped-down airframes. And NATO pilots who encountered MiG-25s on intercept missions saw them accelerate away at speeds no Western fighter could match. What they didn't see was the aftermath, the emergency landings, the engine replacements, the maintenance crews working 16-hour shifts to keep the fleet operational. The MiG-25 wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a high-maintenance bluff, and the bluff had worked for over a decade. Here's the question. Was this deception intentional? Did the Soviet leadership deliberately exaggerate the MiG-25's capabilities to force the United States into an expensive arms race? Or was it just a combination of secrecy, propaganda, and Western paranoia that created a false image? The documents don't give a clear answer, but the effect was real. The F-15 program cost over $6 billion, and a significant portion of that cost was driven by requirements to counter a threat that turned out to be far less capable than anyone thought. Which side are you on? Was the MiG-25 a masterpiece of strategic deception, or just an overhyped interceptor that got lucky? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me what evidence convinces you in defense of the Foxbat. But let's be fair to the Soviets, because dismissing the MiG-25 as junk ignores what it actually accomplished. And if we're going to tell this story honestly, we need to acknowledge the parts where the Americans got it wrong, not because the Soviets lied, but because they misunderstood the mission. The MiG-25 was never designed to be a dogfighter. It was designed to intercept high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and strategic bombers. Specifically, the SR-71 Blackbird and the B-70 Valkyrie. Both of those aircraft flew above 70,000 feet at speeds exceeding Mach 3. No Western fighter could touch them. The Soviets needed something that could climb fast, fly straight, and fire long-range missiles. The MiG-25 did that job extremely well. During the Cold War, Soviet MiG-25 units successfully intercepted multiple SR-71 reconnaissance flights over the Middle East. They couldn't shoot them down because the SR-71 was faster and flew higher, but they could force the Blackbird to alter course, which was operationally valuable. In 1973, Egyptian MiG-25s intercepted Israeli F-4 Phantoms at high altitude. The Phantoms couldn't catch them. The MiG-25s fired R-40 missiles and escaped before the Israelis could respond. That's not the performance profile of a useless aircraft. The problem was that Western intelligence assessed the MiG-25 using Western fighter doctrine. The Americans expected versatility, multi-role capability, air superiority, and ground attack and electronic warfare all in one airframe. That's what the F-15 was designed to do, but the Soviets didn't think that way. They believed in specialized aircraft, one jet for one job. The MiG-25 was a high-altitude interceptor. It wasn't supposed to dogfight, it wasn't supposed to turn, it was supposed to climb to 70,000 feet, fire missiles, and land. And it did that reliably for over 30 years. The steel airframe? Heavy, yes, but also rugged. The MiG-25 could operate from rough airstrips with minimal maintenance infrastructure. Vacuum tubes? Outdated, sure but resistant to battlefield electromagnetic interference. The fuel consumption? A problem for extended patrols, but irrelevant for short intercept missions launched from forward bases. Context matters. The MiG-25 wasn't designed to fight the same war the F-15 was designed to fight. It was designed to defend Soviet airspace against American strategic bombers that never came. So here's the strongest argument for the official Soviet version. The MiG-25 worked. It achieved its design objectives. It deterred American overflights. It forced NATO to develop countermeasures. It served operationally in Egypt, Syria, India, Iraq, Algeria, and Libya. Hundreds of units were produced, and it remained in service until 2013. That's not the record of a failure. But there's a seam in that argument, because if the MiG-25 was fit for purpose, why did the Soviets never build a successor with the same design philosophy? The MiG-31, which replaced the MiG-25, was a fundamentally different aircraft lighter, more maneuverable, better avionics. The MiG-31 fixed every weakness the MiG-25 had, which suggests the Soviets knew the MiG-25 was flawed. They just didn't admit it publicly until Belenko forced their hand. And that brings us to the human element, because Viktor Belenko didn't defect because the aircraft was bad. He defected because the system was worse. Belenko's testimony. The CIA debriefing sessions with Belenko lasted for weeks. Hundreds of hours of interviews, polygraph tests, cross-referenced questions to verify details. The transcripts from those sessions, partially declassified in the 1990s, paint a picture of a man who didn't just want to escape. He wanted to expose the truth. Belenko confirmed the performance limitations. The MiG-25 could not sustain Mach 3. The engines would fail. He'd seen it happen to other pilots. One of his squadron mates had pushed the aircraft too hard during a test flight and had to eject when the turbine seized. The official report blamed pilot error. The truth was, the engines couldn't handle the stress. He confirmed the maintenance problems. Soviet MiG-25 units were chronically short of spare parts. Engines were cannibalized from grounded aircraft to keep operational jets flying. Hydraulic systems leaked. Avionics failed. Pilots flew missions with non-functional radar because replacement tubes weren't available. He confirmed the fuel consumption figures. A standard intercept mission from Chuguyevka lasted less than an hour. Takeoff, climb to altitude patrol zone, descend, land. Total fuel burn, 12 to 13 tons. If you pushed the aircraft hard, you'd land with tanks nearly empty. And he confirmed something the CIA hadn't expected. The Soviets knew the MiG-25 had been overestimated by the West. They knew American intelligence believed the aircraft was more capable than it was. And they did nothing to correct that perception. Why? Because strategic ambiguity was valuable. If NATO believed the MiG-25 was a superweapon, NATO would allocate resources to counter it. That meant fewer resources for other threats. The psychological advantage of an overestimated threat was almost as useful as an actual threat. Belenko called it a maskirovka, a deception operation. Not in the sense that the Soviets deliberately planted false information, but in the sense that they allowed Western intelligence to draw incorrect conclusions from incomplete data and never corrected the record. The Americans had outsmarted themselves. They'd assumed Soviet engineering was more advanced than it actually was. They'd built threat assessments on worst-case scenarios, and when the real capabilities turned out to be lower, they'd already committed billions to the F-15 program. The Soviets didn't need to deceive the West. The West did it to themselves. But here's the final twist. Belenko didn't think the MiG-25 was a complete failure. He thought it was a wasted opportunity. In his autobiography, he describes conversations with Soviet engineers who knew the aircraft's flaws. They'd proposed upgrades, lighter materials, better engines, improved avionics. All of those proposals were rejected because the Ministry of Defense insisted the existing design was adequate. The Soviet system wasn't interested in excellence. It was interested in quotas. The MiG-25 met production targets. It looked impressive on parade. It generated propaganda value. That was enough. Belenko's defection wasn't just about escaping a failing marriage or a corrupt base commander. It was about rejecting a system that prioritized appearances over substance. He took the MiG-25 to Japan because he wanted the world to see the truth. The Soviet Union was a superpower built on compromises and half measures, and the aircraft proved it. The CIA report, completed in December 1976, concluded that the MiG-25 was operationally effective within its design parameters, but strategically overrated. The threat assessment was downgraded. The F-15 program continued, but with adjusted priorities, and NATO air defense doctrine was revised to reflect the MiG-25's actual limitations. The Soviet response was telling. They returned the aircraft in pieces, crates of components, disassembled and labeled. They could have rebuilt it, but they didn't. Instead, they left it as fragments, a psychological message. You can study it all you want. You'll never understand what we're capable of. But the message backfired. Because what the disassembled MiG-25 proved was that Soviet air power wasn't as advanced as anyone thought. The Americans had overestimated the threat, and the Soviets had been content to let them. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Because this isn't just a story about one aircraft or one defection. It's a story about Cold War psychology, about how fear and secrecy and incomplete information create distorted realities, and about how those distortions shape decisions that affect millions of people. The United States spent $6 billion on the F-15 program. That's over $30 billion in today's currency. A significant portion of that investment was driven by the need to counter the MiG-25. Was that money wasted? Not entirely. The F-15 turned out to be one of the most successful fighters in history. It's still in service nearly 50 years later. But the development timeline and cost were inflated by a threat that didn't actually exist at the level intelligence believed. How many other Cold War programs were built on similar miscalculations? How many billions were spent countering capabilities that turned out to be exaggerated? The Soviets made their own miscalculations. They built the MiG-25 to intercept B-70 bombers. The B-70 program was canceled in 1961. By the time the MiG-25 entered service in 1970, the threat it was designed to counter no longer existed. The Soviets kept building MiG-25s anyway, because the production lines were already running, and the system didn't allow for course corrections. Both sides were trapped in a cycle of assumptions and reactions. Each side looked at the other through layers of secrecy and propaganda. Each side assumed the worst-case scenario, and each side built weapons to counter threats that may or may not have been real. Viktor Belenko's defection broke that cycle, at least temporarily. His testimony gave Western intelligence a clearer picture of Soviet capabilities. The MiG-25 disassembly provided hard data instead of speculation. And for a moment, the fog lifted. But the fog returned. Because Cold War competition wasn't really about facts. It was about perceptions, about maintaining credibility, about demonstrating resolve. The truth about the MiG-25 didn't stop the arms race. It just shifted the focus to the next generation of aircraft and the next set of assumptions. Belenko understood that. In his autobiography, he wrote that he didn't defect to help America win the Cold War. He defected because he wanted people to see the truth about the aircraft, about the Soviet system, about the gap between propaganda and reality. He succeeded. But the truth didn't change as much as he hoped it would. That's the moral weight of this story. Intelligence failures aren't just technical mistakes. They're human failures. Failures of imagination, failures of communication, failures to question assumptions. The MiG-25 wasn't a superweapon or a piece of junk. It was an aircraft designed to meet specific requirements by engineers working within specific constraints. The problem was that nobody on either side wanted to see it that clearly. The Soviets needed it to be a propaganda victory. The Americans needed it to be a justification for their own programs. And somewhere in between those needs, the truth got lost. What happened next? Viktor Belenko received asylum in the United States. The CIA relocated him under a new identity. He worked as a consultant for aerospace companies, sharing his knowledge of Soviet aircraft and tactics. He never returned to Russia. His wife and son remained in the Soviet Union. He never saw them again. The Soviets officially declared him a traitor. They court-martialed him in absentia, but they never explained why he defected. The official story was that he'd lost his way during a training flight. Nobody believed that. The MiG-25 stayed in service for another 37 years. Soviet pilots continued to fly it. Some of them probably knew the truth about its limitations. Most didn't care. It did its job. That was enough. Belenko died in 2023 at the age of 76. He lived to see the Cold War end. He lived to see the Soviet Union collapse. And he lived to see his decision vindicated. The MiG-25 he brought to Japan is now displayed at the Pacific Aviation Museum in Hawaii. A relic of a war that was fought with fear and assumptions as much as weapons. The F-15 is still flying, still winning, still proving that sometimes the best response to an exaggerated threat is to build something genuinely excellent. And the Soviet Union? They returned the MiG-25 in crates, never reassembled, a pile of components that once flew at Mach 2.8. A reminder that even superweapons have limits, and sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes not from satellites or spies, but from one man who decided the truth was worth the risk. Here's my question for you. If you were a Soviet engineer in 1970, knowing the MiG-25's flaws, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent and let the system continue? What's more dangerous? A weapon that doesn't work as advertised, or a system that punishes people for telling the truth? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me where you draw the line. And if you want to support investigations like this one, if you want more deep dives into the stories intelligence agencies tried to bury, check the first link in the description. Your support makes this work possible, because the truth doesn't come cheap, and it never stops being worth the cost. Next time, we're opening another file, another aircraft, another secret that somebody thought would stay buried, but nothing stays buried forever. I'll see you then.